Konrad Curze was right. A damning statement, no doubt. For who could look upon the life of one so vile as Curze and see anything other than a chronicle of atrocities perpetuated by a mind gripped with madness? Indeed, the master and sire of the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, was many things. A king of darkness and of terror, the Lord of the Night, the last judge, and perhaps most infamously, the Night Haunter. He was a monster, a terror, a nightmare-given form. He was the darkest son of a bright lord, cold-hearted despite his father having been the flame of promise. Konrad Curze was many things, but more so than any other epithets or titles, he was right. The Emperor of mankind, in his wisdom, forged his 20 Primarchs, not as lesser versions of himself, but rather as aspects of his being. Within each of his demigod sons was the embodiment of specific traits and qualities. No doubt, this was with the intention of each Primarch fulfilling a specialized duty upon their maturation. Rubute Gilliman's inherent talent for logistics and strategy made him a masterful administrator. Vulcan, whose abilities at the forge were only ever matched by his humanity, crafted singular weapons and devices of peerless quality and beauty. And Sanguinius, the angel himself, was the vision of hope and devotion in the ideals of the imperial truth, and by extension, the Emperor of mankind. Alas, it is nothing short of a tragedy that the Primarch's upbringing and tutelage was not with their creator and father. How different future events might have played out had not the fell powers of chaos stole the infant Primarchs away and scattered them across the galaxy. No, the Emperor's true intentions for his sons may never be known, and yet despite his absence from their lives, each Primarch would mature and begin to display their own unique superhuman gifts upon the worlds they had landed on. Lorgar, the charismatic orator, found his calling amongst the faithful of Colchis as a preacher. Lehman Russ, whose genetic code had been spliced with lupine DNA, was adopted into a pack by a she-wolf upon the frozen world of Fenris. Mortarion, who, as but a mere child, survived and grew to flourish on the poison-choked world of Barbarous, his superhuman fortitude allowing him to endure and adapt to his new home. Each Primarch, in time, would discover their innate talents and come to shape their worlds and its people around them. And Konrad Curze would be no different. Nostramo was a world of perpetual darkness, polluted by industry and orbiting a dying star. What light reached the world was unable to pierce the smog-filled skies. The people of the lightless planet were as pale as they were morose, for not only was Nostramo without sunlight, it was without hope. Crime ran rampant across the world, like a virus. It infected and affected every strata in society, from the ruling elite in the upper echelons to the poorest of the working class. Lawlessness was rife. Not a day could pass where an individual would not witness, perpetrate, or be victim to a crime. Such was the prolific nature of Nostramo's criminal elements that homicide accounted for one of the world's unintended means of population control, the other being the all-too-regular decision by Nostraman citizens to escape their mortal torment on their own terms. The disparity between the wealthy and the poor was vast, and social mobility was non-existent. The gulf in power between the elite and the working class prevented those who lived amongst the minute-by-minute muggings, murders, robberies, and worse from ever being able to change anything. This suited Nostramo's ruling class, who themselves benefited from multiple criminal enterprises and sponsored the numerous gang wars as a means of entertainment. Nostramo was a world without hope, light, kindness, or promise, and it would be here that not only did Konrad Curze arrive, but also where he'd find his purpose. To keep the tale of Konrad Curze's life upon Nostramo brief, I shall surmise it as such. Never before in the history of all mankind has terror reigned so totally that a world was brought to heel. Through the implementation of absolute brutality and uncompromising savagery, Curze enacted a campaign of bloodshed and mutilation on any and all lawbreakers. Infused within the Primarch at seemingly a genetic level was a binary sense of justice and judgment. There was no nuance, no context, no second chances, no mercy. To break the law, any law upon Nostramo was to suffer the ultimate punishment at the hands of the creature that stalked the dark streets. Night Haunter, the moniker given to the arbiter of vengeance on all wrongdoers by the terrified populace, would rid the world of crime in a single bloody year. Like his brothers, Konrad Curze had talents and gifts as well as a particular philosophy that shaped his formative years. For almost all of his brothers, their foundational years were further influenced by adoptive families and surrogates, who fostered certain attitudes in the maturing Primarchs. Empathy, duty, loyalty, brotherhood, and nobility were amongst the qualities introduced to the fledgling demigods, as well as many others. Curze, however, had no such teachers or instructors. He grew up alone, surrounded by cruelty and the cold night of Nostramo. No one was there to temper the young Primarch. No one to teach him the intricacies of mankind's nature or to demonstrate the frailty of the human condition. No one was there to instruct Curze in the proper application of law and order, justice and reprisal, compensation and force. Konrad Curze was alone, and so he would learn alone. The purest example of the Emperor's genecraft, except for perhaps the Lion, who spent his early life alone within the wilds of Caliban. The innate drive to survive inherent in each Primarch ensured Curze would not become another nameless body found murdered in a back alley. Curze would fight and feed, dress in rags, and sleep in gutters. He would hide in the shadows and move across rooftops, out of sight. Curze would watch, and he would observe, and with time begin to comprehend what Nostramo needed. Understand, my fellow travelers, Konrad Curze was not motivated by empathy. How could one who had done such as he ever even consider the word? No, Curze did as he was wont to do, because of what the Emperor intended him to be. Konrad Curze was to be the Emperor's sanction, to be his final sentence and weapon of terror. If Sanguinius were to soar highest within the Imperial truth's light, then Konrad Curze would stalk below, within its shadows, hunting those who would refuse its wisdom. The Emperor poured his vast intellect of the scientific and arcane into the Primarch's design, each one crafted to his uncompromising standards. None of all the Emperor's creations, save perhaps his custodies, received such time, resources, and commitment of effort in their manufacture. Be under no illusion, my friends, each Primarch was exactly the way the Master of Mankind intended them to be. Perhaps to that, you would point out the 8th Primarch's psychosis as a flaw in my hypothesis. Indeed, upon first viewing Curze's mental instability, it appears to be a dangerous oversight on the Emperor's behalf. But even a broken sword can cut, to quote the Emperor himself regarding the 12th Primarch Angron, although Curze was certainly no Red Angel. No, Curze was gifted by his father with foresight, just as Sanguinius was. The great angel would divine mankind's future to all the better inspire the Imperium towards it. The Night Haunter would peer into the futures of all men and know their crimes. For what better way to enact justice than to prevent the breaking of law in the first place? It was only due to Curze's lacking mastery of his gift and the subsequent visions of his brother's actions during the heresy that ultimately drove him to madness. Dreams and waking nightmares of a galaxy of flame and billions dying haunted the Primarch's mind. A grim, dark future of eternal war was revealed to Konrad Curze, and lacking a slither of hope for mankind to overcome its violent nature, thanks to the bleakness of Nostromo that had saturated his soul. The Primarch's view became irreparably nihilistic. Humanity could not be trusted to make the right choices for itself. History had shown time and time again that mankind's primitive nature would inevitably lead to anarchy and ultimately its own extinction. Control and order was needed. The human race must comply for its own survival, and if it would not submit willingly, then a reminder of the horrors of old night would be necessary. A lesson in darkness, as some might say. The 8th Legion, prior to its reunion with their Primarch, had been founded on terror, with its initial aspirants drawn from the deep prison sinks that littered the desolate places of old Earth. Children had been born in these places of darkness and death, adjusting to both the lightless environment as well as the cutthroat mentality required to survive. These children of darkness thrived. The Emperor, in his unknowable wisdom, decreed these savage wretches would be the first wave of recruits used to found the 8th. Taken by the nascent Imperium, they were cut open, altered, reconditioned, improved, and sewn back together. For those who survived the invasive and agonizing surgeries, their new fate lay before them. As the Emperor's Astartes, they would aid him in completing his unification of Terra, then his total conquest of the galaxy under humanity's dominance. However, the 8th was not just another legion. Its origins lay in darkness, and so too would its purpose. Just as nightmares come for us in the hours of darkness, the 8th would stalk forth to bring terror and retribution to the Emperor's enemies. For those whose transgressions could not be forgiven and were so terrible that they could never be allowed to transpire again, the 8th would be unleashed to render final judgment. Fire methods considered extreme even by the standards of its cousin legions, the 8th would ensure that not only was its target extinguished in its totality, but that a statement had been made. A declaration to all who would break faith with the Emperor and his Imperium, to willingly stray from the master of mankind's light, to engage in non-sanctioned activity, or to meddle in abhorrent sciences and practices, to bring harm to the Emperor's dream for humanity, or to contradict his imperial truth in the most egregious ways. There could be no forgiveness. Only despair and death, fear and finality, terror and torment. For those who worked against the Emperor, there could be only one verdict: the sending of the 8th. It should be apparent that even without its Primarch to command them, the Master of Mankind still utilized the 8th Legion to be his terror weapon. Everything about them, from its aspirants to its modus operandi, were all utilized to mold the Legion into a force of remorseless killers. With no morals or ethical qualms, the 8th would commit atrocities with tactical precision. A torturous scalpel and pliers, able to slowly dissect and pick apart the enemy at its leisure, drawing out the horror to paralyze any resistance and extending the torment in order to break all vestiges of morale. Mass psychosis would grip a population, its people turning inward as abject terror made them uncontrollable. All the while, the Eighth would watch as its foe tore itself to pieces and record the madness to deploy as a psychological weapon in future campaigns. From the Saragorn Enclave to the court of Antius, the Eighth annihilated them all, for they had opposed the Emperor and his Imperium. Their guilt had been absolute, and so their punishment would be as well. But why, fellow travelers, did the Emperor ever decree such a force of monsters be created? Why personally develop and mold into being one such as Konrad Curze? What need was there for such abominations? To answer these questions, we do not have to ponder for long, nor must we search far. The reason is simple, really. Control. The Imperiumofman was and is a galaxy-spanning empire of over 1 million worlds. Despite the Legiones Astartes, the Imperial Army and the Navy, and even the Mechanicum, there wasn't enough resources to effectively govern every world, and a ship responding to a distress call may arrive too late to aid the beleaguered. Warp storms, psychic disruption, flickers in the Astronomicon, and interstellar phenomena can all isolate a world from the wider Imperium. These worlds would be required to maintain their oaths to the Emperor despite being cut off. Governorship of compliant worlds was always bestowed upon only the most loyal subjects, and it would be the responsibility of these individuals to ensure these worlds were kept to the standard expected of them by the Emperor. However, the hearts of men are fickle, and power breeds corruption like a corpse spawns flies. Given rulership of a world, it was not unheard of that a governor may overreach in his purview. They may grow complacent and allow tithes to fall below acceptable margins, or conversely, become a callous tyrant whose dictatorship festered mass uprisings. Regardless of the cause, worlds considered territory claimed by the Imperium could and did slip through its fingers. Re-establishing control was paramount, but by the time word reached Terra of a planet's succession from its empire, and a fleet gathered to retake it, said world could have been turned into a veritable fortress. A campaign launched to secure it could cost tens of millions of lives, and tie up valuable resources needed elsewhere for years or even maybe decades. What was needed was a shadow of retribution, long and dark, forever lingering over the hearts of would-be turncoats and dissidents. A thorn in the minds of the traitors that out in the darkness they were watching and waiting. Talons sharp and eyes of pitiless black. The Eighth Legion. Hope, progress, understanding and promise would motivate mankind to heights never thought possible until the Emperor's coming. Fear, dread, terror, and the certainty of what would befall any who moved against the Emperor and his Imperium would keep its people loyal across the breadth of the galaxy. With Konrad Curze reunion, with his father and his assuming command of the Eighth Legion, this task would begin anew. Refashioned as the Night Lords, Curze would set out to bring worlds into compliance with his father's Imperium. For the alien and the mutant, only fire awaited them, but for the lost colonies of humanity, a far darker fate lay before them. Millions would die when a legion assaulted a world. Orbital bombardment, drop pod assault, heavy weapons and artillery, the intense, hyper-violent warfare of the Astartes, all would leave countless dead in its wake. Yet this was permissible as the Imperium considered it collateral damage, the price paid by the ignorant for refusing to submit and comply. In fact, it could be said that this kind of indiscriminate warfare was praised for its nobility. Warrior against warrior, blade against blade, bullet for bullet. Never mind that a superhuman Astartes often faced baseline humans who had no hope of standing against their home's invaders. To the Imperium, this was seen as the clean way to wage war. Curze and his Night Lords had a somewhat more pragmatic, albeit sadistic, method of securing compliance. The Night Lords would utilize psychological warfare, destabilizing a world from within with atrocity after atrocity. World leaders would be abducted, skinned alive, then returned, only to be found in a public area. Crowds drawn by the grim spectacle, who in turn would start to spread the word. More abductions, in greater numbers, or taken without raising the alarm and returned just as such, but minus their flesh. Freak, manufactured accidents, assassinations, chemical warfare, bombings, and disruption to communications via horrific broadcasts of other Night Lord atrocities all sapped the will of the populace. A world was falling from within, and not a shot had been fired. Rumors spread like a plague. Towns that had been lively and full of people disappeared in a night. Creatures clad in the skins of the living with eyes of burning crimson had been seen. Voices, the sound of deathly whispers, promised death, and yet no source of them could be found. Paranoia grew like vineweed, twisting and gripping all in its clutches. Fear led to hysteria, and hysteria erupted into violence. Mobs of rioters demanded action from leaders powerless to do anything. No one knew who was to blame. All anyone had to offer was hearsay and speculation. Cities burned with fire and madness as people fell upon each other. Father turned on son, mother turned on daughter. Neighbors became enemies, friends became adversaries. Everyone was guilty in the eyes of everyone else, and all the while the mutilations and disappearances continued, and a world ate itself alive as terror drove the populace to frenzied violence in a bid to reassert control. Upon the precipice of complete self-annihilation, they would descend from their voidcraft to crush the final stalwart remnants of resistance. The Night Lords had won. The toll of their victory counted in the hollow stares of a populace beholding their new masters for the first time, despite suffering beneath their claws for weeks, if not months. Minds now broken and hearts shattered, the civilians had nothing left to fight back with. The price paid already had been a reign of terror that had flayed the sanity of all. Nerves raw and exposed, eyes empty of light and always scanning the shadows for nightmares stalking them. The Night Lord's work was done, and compliance was guaranteed. All would remember the coming of the Eighth to their world. Tales and stories would pass from generation to generation, down through the decades, turning to centuries, and inevitably millennia. They would be embellished and mutate with time as they were told and retold, and through this, the lesson in darkness would never die. The potential for dissidence was expunged, a world not so much as breathing a whisper of dissent for fear they would return. The Lords of the Night. It is a grim fact, but one that must be acknowledged. Of all 20 legions, the worlds brought into compliance by the Eighth saw the fewest accounts of rebellion against Imperial rule. Terror had broken these worlds, and terror would keep them in line, for none would dare risk the obsidian gaze of the Night Lords once more falling upon them. Such was the potency of their threat, that worlds as yet untouched by them would rapidly comply to their demands, having heard of the atrocities committed by the sons of Konrad Curze. Fear spread like venom injected into the bloodstream. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, had suffered unimaginable torment and death, so that billions could be spared. This was to be the dark legacy of Konrad Curze. This had been the purpose for which he had been created. Alas, perhaps history would be more understanding of the Night Haunter's methods, had it not been for his worsening psychosis, the ever-increasing cruelty of his legion, and the root cause of all the evil that poisoned the Night Lords. Nostramo. Curze had left his world ordered and compliant by his design. Through butchery and brutality, Curze had rid the world of criminality. However, With the shadow of the Night Haunter no longer stalking the streets of Nostromo, the ingrained darkness in the hearts of its people returned. The reign of Curze had been brief in comparison to the totality of Nostromo's human history. Criminality had been a fact of life for generations, and with the Dark King gone, the old order reasserted itself, and it would not be content to remain upon Nostromo. Those elements of the criminal population deemed too extreme even for Nostromo were given to the Legion in a bid to rid the world of their blight. Psychopaths, sadists, and degenerates became the lifeblood of the 8th Legion. As the Terran Astartes fell to the attrition of war, the Nostraman Marines took their roles. Battle brothers, squad leaders, line officers, company commanders, and Legion masters would all eventually be of Nostraman stock, all of whom carried the sickness of their world. A legion of superhuman monsters, murderers and the criminally insane elevated to the status of transhuman demigods of war. The darkness of Nostromo could and would be spread out into the galaxy. Fear and terror in the name of order and compliance steadily rotted away until fear and terror for their own sake became the Night Lord's mantra. The Imperium, already disturbed and disdainful of the Eighth's methods, became utterly reviled by the complete lack of morality or ethics displayed by them. Cruelty and sadism on planetary scales, the genocide of whole populations, worlds guilty of nothing but being in the Night Lord's path put to the sword. The Emperor and his Imperium would no longer tolerate their madness, and Curze and his Legion would suffer the punishment of exile to the borders of Imperial space. Unsupported and undersupplied, the Legion only descended deeper into darkness, and became little better than raiders and pirates. Acting on their own whims, they prowled the darkness, killing and pillaging as they pleased. Had it not been for the Lupercal's heresy and the subsequent galactic firestorm, then the fate of the Night Lords at the command of the Emperor might well have been total obliteration. What happened next is known to all. The Night Lord's murder of Nostromo. Davin, Istvan, the Dropside Massacre, Prospero Calth, Cygnus Prime, Thramus, Imperium Secundus, Molech, Talon, Beta Garman, Terra, the Vengeful Spirit, Horus, the Emperor, the End and the Death. The traitors were defeated, the Imperium victorious, but the dream was dead. Stagnation and atrophy was all that awaited mankind in the dark future. The traitor forces driven off, fractured, splintered, and scattered. Most fled into the Eye of Terror, there to seethe and rage and turn on each other out of bitterness for their failures. The Night Lords would follow their treacherous cousin legions, but unlike their kin, they would abhor the demonic. True, some would turn to the Dark Pantheon for power, but to many amongst the Eighth, such a prospect was abominable. The Night Lords would, for the most part, become little better than bands of pirates and raiders. Scavenging to survive, the Night Lords were no longer a cohesive legion. That, and also, Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter himself, would be lost to his sons. Upon Segualsa, where Curze and the Lion had first met in personal combat, the sire of the 8th Legion would construct a dark fortress, and here he would wait. Not for his errant sons to return to him, although they did, nor to reconstitute power and reignite a new civil war against the Imperium. No, Konrad Curze waited on Sequelsa to die. Always had the Primarch known that he would be slain at the hands of one of his father's assassins. Curze, ever the nihilist, accepted this fate, knowing that to do so would prove him right in death. If everything had been fated from the start, then all Curze had done, no matter how cruel or sadistic, would always have been destined to pass. The Primarch would be the victim of a conspiracy he was aware of, but powerless to resist. Just as the Angel had known the manner of his own death, and tried to alter it through circumventing the natural laws of the universe, only to find he could not fight his fate. Curze, too, had known what was coming for him. Unlike his brother, though, Curze was not naive in believing he could escape destiny's clutches. Konrad Curze would die upon the blade of the assassin Emshen, his death vindicating the Lord of the Night and proving the hypocrisy of his father and the empire that had betrayed him and his sons. The Emperor had made him as his terror weapon. The Master of Mankind had forged him to be his final sanction, and when Curze had done as intended, he had been vilified and condemned. The Emperor had lied. He had deceived his son. The Emperor was false. Yet, it cannot be denied, the methods of the Eighth had grown beyond its initial mandate. The influence of Nostromo and the Primarch's deteriorating sanity warped the Legion from their role as necessary monsters into only monsters. Compelled and motivated by nothing more than cruelty for cruelty's sake and spreading terror not to instill order, but for their own sadistic pleasure. How, then, can I justify the premise that Konrad Curze was right? By the standards of the Great Crusade and the Imperium the Emperor dreamed of? I can't. Curze was too broken, his legion too sick to continue on its path into debauchery and darkness. The Emperor was more than capable of saving his son, but he either chose not to, or did not care enough to. Curze suffered and lingered in torment until finally he died, alone and mad, laughing a humorless laugh and smiling a mirthless smile. Konrad Curze was not the Primarch the Imperium needed then. He is the Primarch the Imperium needs now. In the 41st millennium, when the days grow short and darkness creeps in, as the enemies of mankind gather and the walls crumble, as the fires rise and the ashes of countless worlds rain down on those cowering in the Emperor's fading light, what the Imperium needs to survive is unity and order. Rebellion, insurrection, cults and heretics all weaken a dying empire even as the enemy tears at the gates to mankind's realm. Humanity's enemies are as much within as they are without, and despite the best efforts of the Arbites, the Planetary Defense Forces, the Adeptus Astartes, and the Inquisition, they simply aren't enough. These forces are desperately needed elsewhere, and yet they must constantly look inwards when they should be looking out. The Imperium needs order, and the only one capable of unifying mankind in this age of ending is Konrad Curze. Ruled as much by superstition as it is by corrupt old men, a figure such as the Night Haunter would prove devastatingly effective at reasserting the Emperor's will across the Imperium. The Angel of Vengeance, the Emperor's own Justicar, the Dark Judge. Word of his presence would carry across the stars, and none would dare work against it for fear that the Haunter of the Night might come for them. It is indeed likely that with mankind compliant and committed to a unified effort to resist its enemies, Konrad Curze could focus on purging the Imperium's debased institutions of its corrupt elements. From Holy Terror itself to the Galactic Rim, none would be safe from his talons should they serve their own interests over that of the Imperium. Alongside a master administrator like Rabute Gilliman, or the inspirational, almost divine presence of the Angel, the Imperium could be reinvigorated and rebuilt like never before. A new renaissance, upheld by the lore of Curze and his legion. The wardens and enforcers, the judges and jurors, the executors of the will of him upon terror. Such a reign of hope and terror, of progress renewed and fear ever present. It would be as wondrous as it would be terrible. Two sides of the same coin, binary in all aspects, just like the eighth Primarch himself. I cannot say I choose to dwell in such a place, but I can say it would be better than the current state of affairs. The Imperium is dying, its rotting carcass picked over from without and from within. An ignoble end for a dream of such promise and possibility. But the Emperor is lost to us, just as are all his sons. Lesser men rule in their stead, and we are but slaves to this dark fate we find ourselves ensnared to. The Emperor promised salvation, but with him gone, we can but wait for the dying of the light. Perhaps it is what mankind deserves as punishment for all its transgressions. Maybe in extinction would we find absolution for our sins. Maybe death is nothing compared to vindication.